When a CEO mocked a single father on a luxury flight, she had no idea that within hours, this humble man would become the only thing standing between 200 passengers and certain death. What happened next will restore your faith in hidden heroes and prove that true worth can't be measured by wealth alone. The gentle hum of Flight 789's engines couldn't mask the tension brewing in business class as Nathan Hayes struggled with the familiar dance of single parenthood at 30,000 feet. His weathered hands, scarred from years of military service, fumbled with his 7-year-old daughter Olivia's seatbelt while she bounced excitedly in the plush leather seat beside him. "Daddy, look! The clouds look like cotton candy." Olivia pressed her small face against the oval window, her breath fogging the glass as her unicorn backpack slipped from her lap onto the pristine cabin floor. Nathan's tired eyes crinkled with the kind of smile that had sustained him through 3 years of widowhood. "They sure do, sweetheart. Your mama used to say the same thing." He bent to retrieve the backpack, his faded military surplus jacket pulling tight across his shoulders, a jacket that had seen better days, but still carried the ghost of his wife Sarah's perfume in its worn fabric. From across the aisle, Astrid Sterling's perfectly manicured fingers paused over her platinum MacBook keyboard. The CEO of Sterling Dynamics had built her empire on reading people on identifying weakness and exploiting it for profit. Her ice blue eyes, framed by designer glasses that cost more than most people's monthly salary, swept over Nathan's appearance with the clinical precision of a predator sizing up prey. The discount store jeans, the scuffed boots that had walked through more combat zones than boardrooms, the way he apologized softly when Olivia's excitement caused her to kick the seat in front of them. Everything about this man screamed, "Doesn't belong." And Astrid Sterling had made a career of ensuring people knew exactly where they stood in her world's hierarchy. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. The flight attendant, a young woman named Rebecca, whose smile had been growing increasingly strained, hurried over with practiced efficiency. "Yes, Ms. Sterling. Is there anything I can get for you?" Astrid's gaze never left Nathan as she spoke. "I'm curious about the seating arrangements. When I pay premium prices for business class, I expect a certain atmosphere. I wasn't aware we were running a charity service today." The words hung in the recycled air like poison, and Nathan felt every passenger within earshot turn to stare. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a reflex drilled into him by years of military discipline, but his voice remained steady. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" "Oh, there's no problem at all," Astrid replied, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I was just wondering how someone on what appears to be a very limited budget managed to afford these seats. Did you win a contest? Or perhaps this is some sort of make-a-wish situation?" The blood drained from Nathan's face, but before he could respond, Olivia's clear voice cut through the tension like a blade. "My daddy saved all his money for 3 months, so we could sit together on our trip to see Grandma Rose. He works really, really hard." The simplicity of the child's words seemed to amplify the cruelty of Astrid's implications. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others, emboldened by the CEO's brazen display, began to whisper among themselves. 3 months. Astrid laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. How quaint. I suppose everyone has their own definition of financial planning. Nathan's hands clenched into fists on his armrests, and for a moment, the trained killer that lived beneath his gentle exterior stirred. He had faced down enemy combatants in the mountains of Afghanistan, had stared death in the face more times than he cared to count, but nothing had prepared him for the particular cruelty of civilian judgment. Daddy. Olivia's small hand found her intuitive understanding of tension far beyond her years. Are you okay? The touch of his daughter's fingers acted like a circuit breaker, instantly diffusing the dangerous energy building in Nathan's chest. He looked down into eyes that were exact replicas of Sarah's warm brown pools that still held all the innocence the world hadn't yet managed to steal. I'm fine, baby girl, he whispered, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. Just fine. But he wasn't fine. Nothing about this situation was fine. The seat beside him, the one that should have held Sarah's warm presence, remained empty, filled only by the ghost of their shared dreams and the crushing weight of medical bills that had devoured their savings like a malevolent tide. 3 years ago, Sarah Hayes had been the strongest person Nathan knew. A kindergarten teacher who could corral 30 sugar-fueled 5-year-olds with nothing but patience and genuine love. She had been his anchor, his reason for leaving the military and trying to build a normal life. The diagnosis had come on a Tuesday, pancreatic cancer stage 4 prognosis measured in months rather than years. Nathan had fought for her with the same fierce determination he'd shown in combat, maxing out credit cards, taking out loans against their modest home, selling everything that wasn't nailed down. But cancer didn't negotiate, didn't accept bribes or surrender to desperate prayers whispered in hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. The treatments had bought them time, precious, beautiful, heartbreaking time, but they had also bought debt. Mountains of it. The kind that followed a man like a shadow, coloring every financial decision with the knowledge that one medical emergency, one missed paycheck, one moment of weakness could send everything tumbling down. So yes, he had saved for 3 months to afford these seats. He had worked double shifts at the airport maintenance facility, fixing the very planes that people like Astrid Sterling took for granted. He had eaten peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day, had mended his clothes, instead of buying new ones, had counted every penny with the precision of a military quartermaster. But Olivia didn't need to know about the sacrifices. She didn't need to understand that her father's love for her was measured not in dollars spent, but in dollars saved, in moments of comfort carved out from a life that had forgotten how to be comfortable. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, momentarily interrupting the social theater playing out in business class. "We're experiencing some minor turbulence as we cross the Atlantic. Please return to your seats and ensure your seat belts are securely fastened." As if summoned by the announcement, the aircraft gave a gentle shudder, nothing more than a reminder of the thin metal shell that separated them from the vast emptiness below. But Nathan felt something else, a subtle change in the engine note that his trained ear caught immediately. It was probably nothing, likely just a minor adjustment in altitude or airspeed, but 15 years as a military pilot had given him an almost supernatural sensitivity to aircraft behavior. "Daddy, I'm scared of the bumps," Olivia whispered, her earlier excitement dampened by the adult tension swirling around them. Nathan unbuckled his seatbelt long enough to help her settle more comfortably, adjusting her safety restraint with the careful precision of someone who understood that details could mean the difference between life and death. "It's just the airplane dancing with the wind, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." From across the aisle, Astrid Sterling watched this interaction with something approaching confusion. In her world, problems were solved with money inefficiencies eliminated through strategic restructuring. The sight of a father's gentle patience with his child represented a foreign language she had forgotten how to speak if she had ever known it at all. Her own childhood had been a masterclass in emotional efficiency. Private schools, nannies, tutors, everything necessary to produce a successful human being. Nothing wasteful, like unconditional love or patient understanding. Her parents, both high-powered executives themselves, had treated her development like a business project complete with quarterly performance reviews and strategic 5-year plans. It had worked, of course. By 35, Astrid commanded a business empire worth hundreds of millions, her name mentioned alongside titans of industry in Forbes and Fortune. She owned homes on 3 continents, a yacht that required its own crew, and art that museums begged to borrow. Success by any measurable standard. Yet something about the simple intimacy between Nathan and his daughter stirred memories she had spent decades burying. A flash of her own father checking his watch during her piano recitals. Her mother explaining that affection was a luxury they couldn't afford if Astrid wanted to compete in a man's world. The gradual hardening of her heart until emotions became strategic tools rather than genuine experiences. "Ma'am," Rebecca, the flight attendant, appeared beside Astrid's seat, her voice carefully neutral. "Is there anything specific you need assistance with regarding the other passengers?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Astrid could escalate this situation, could use her influence to make life difficult for the man and his daughter. It would be easy, a few words to the right people. A complaint about inappropriate seating policies, the kind of casual cruelty that had become second nature in her business dealings. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the way Olivia had defended her father with such fierce love, or the quiet dignity with which Nathan had absorbed insults that would have sent lesser men into rage. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition of something she had lost so long ago she had forgotten it ever existed. "No," she said finally, her voice losing its sharp edge. "No, there's nothing." Rebecca nodded and moved away, leaving Astrid alone with the uncomfortable realization that she had just backed down from a confrontation for the first time in years. The feeling was so foreign, she wasn't sure how to process it. Meanwhile, Nathan was helping Olivia color in a princess coloring book, his large hands guiding her smaller ones as they carefully stayed within the lines. His voice was soft, encouraging, completely focused on his daughter, despite the undercurrent of tension that still flowed through the cabin. "This princess looks just like Mama, don't you think?" Olivia asked, holding up a page featuring a blonde woman in a flowing gown. Nathan's breath caught for just a moment, so briefly that anyone not watching closely would have missed it. "She sure does, baby. Mama would love this picture. I'm going to give it to her when we see her again," Olivia announced with the matter-of-fact confidence of childhood. Nathan's eyes closed for just a heartbeat, and in that tiny gesture Astrid caught a glimpse of pain so profound it made her chest tighten with unfamiliar empathy. She realized with startling clarity that this man wasn't just struggling financially, he was carrying the weight of loss, of single parenthood, of trying to be everything to a child who still believed in fairy tales and happily ever after. The airplane shuddered again, more violently this time, and somewhere in the distance Astrid heard the faint sound of alarms from the cockpit. But her attention remained fixed on the man across the aisle, this stranger, who had somehow cracked open something she thought she had sealed away forever. She didn't know that within the next hour, Nathan Hayes would reveal himself to be far more than a struggling single father in an old jacket. She didn't know that the hands she had watched so gently guide a coloring crayon had once controlled fighter jets worth more than her entire quarterly profit. She didn't know that the quiet man she had dismissed as beneath her notice would soon become the only thing standing between every soul on Flight 789 and the cold, unforgiving Atlantic Ocean. But she was about to find out. As the turbulence increased and nervous murmurs began to ripple through the cabin, Nathan Hayes straightened in his seat with the subtle alertness of a predator sensing danger. His trained ears caught sounds. The other passengers missed the slight irregularity in engine rhythm, the too frequent course corrections, the barely audible tension in the captain's voice over the intercom. Something was wrong with Flight 789, and Nathan Hayes was the only person on board qualified to help. The question was, would his pride allow him to reveal the truth about who he really was? The subtle changes Nathan had detected in the aircraft's behavior were becoming impossible to ignore. What had started as minor turbulence was evolving into something far more sinister, and his military-trained instincts were screaming warnings that the other passengers couldn't hear. The engine note had developed an irregular flutter, almost like a heartbeat with an arrhythmia, and the plane's movements had taken on the subtle but unmistakable characteristics of an aircraft fighting against mechanical failure. Olivia had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her coloring book sliding forgotten into her lap, one small hand still clutching the purple crayon she'd been using to color the princess's shoes. Nathan adjusted her position carefully, his movements economical and precise, despite the increasing turbulence. Every instinct told him to remain calm, to project the steady confidence that had kept his squadron alive through countless missions over hostile territory. But this wasn't a combat zone where he could rely on his training and his aircraft's capabilities. This was civilian airspace, and he was just another passenger stripped of authority and agency, forced to trust in pilots he'd never met, flying an aircraft whose maintenance history he couldn't verify. The realization hit him like a physical blow. For the first time in 15 years, Nathan Hayes was truly powerless. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Henry Collins' voice crackled over the intercom again, but this time Nathan caught the subtle tension beneath the professional calm. We're experiencing some technical difficulties that require our immediate attention. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for possible emergency procedures." The words landed in the passenger cabin like grenades. Conversations died. Mid-sentence, laptop snapped shut, and the artificial cheer that had characterized the first hour of the flight evaporated instantly. Rebecca and her fellow flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency through the aisles, their smiles now strained as they checked seatbelts and secured loose items. Across the aisle, Astrid Sterling's face had gone pale beneath her perfectly applied makeup. Her manicured fingers gripped the armrest of her seat with white-knuckled intensity, and for the first time since Nathan had observed her, she looked vulnerable, human. "Daddy?" Olivia stirred against his shoulder, awakened by the change in atmosphere and the increasing violence of the turbulence. "What's happening?" Nathan's hand found her cheek, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her face with infinite tenderness. "Just some bumpy air, sweetheart. Nothing we can't handle." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, his trained ear was cataloging disasters. The irregular engine rhythm suggested possible compressor failure. The way the aircraft was fighting to maintain altitude indicated hydraulic problems. And beneath it all, the subtle but growing vibration that spoke of structural stress approaching critical thresholds. The next announcement from the cockpit confirmed his worst fears. "This is Captain Collins speaking. We have experienced a medical emergency in the cockpit, and our first officer is unable to continue his duties." The pause that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. "If there are any licensed pilots aboard this aircraft, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately." The words hung in the pressurized air like a death sentence. Nathan felt every muscle in his body tense, every nerve ending suddenly alive with the electric clarity that had once made him one of the Air Force's most decorated fighter pilots. Around him, passengers erupted into panicked whispers and barely contained sobs. "Oh God," someone whispered from the row behind them. "Oh God, we're going to die." "Pilots don't just ask for help unless—" Another voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Astrid Sterling was staring directly at Nathan, now her ice-blue eyes wide with a mixture of terror and something else, a dawning recognition that perhaps she had misjudged everything about this quiet man in his faded jacket. Her business empire, her carefully constructed world of power and influence meant nothing at 37,000 feet with failing engines and an incapacitated co-pilot. Nathan closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 200 lives pressing down on his shoulders. He thought of Sarah, of the promise he had made at her bedside during those final days. "Promise me," she had whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. "Promise me you'll stay safe for Olivia. No more flying, no more risks. She needs her daddy." He had promised, had meant it with every fiber of his being. Had walked away from the only career he'd ever known, had traded his pilot's wings for a maintenance worker's coveralls, had buried the part of himself that lived most fully in the cockpit of high-performance aircraft. But now, with his daughter's warm weight against his shoulder, and the desperate plea of Captain Collins echoing through the cabin, that promise felt like a chain around his throat. "Daddy?" Olivia's voice was small, frightened. "Why is everyone so scared?" Nathan opened his eyes and looked down into the face that was his entire world. Sarah's eyes looked back at him, trusting, innocent, completely confident that her father could fix anything. In that moment, he understood that keeping his promise to Sarah might mean breaking an even more fundamental promise, the one every parent makes, to protect their child from harm. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like yellow flowers blooming in a garden of fear. Screams erupted throughout the cabin as passengers fumbled with the unfamiliar equipment, their panic infectious and absolute. "Everyone remain calm," Rebecca shouted over the chaos, but her own voice betrayed the terror she was fighting to contain. "Follow the safety instructions. Place the mask over your nose and mouth." Nathan helped Olivia with her oxygen mask, his movements swift and sure, despite the aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior. But his mind was already in the cockpit, running through emergency procedures, calculating approach angles and fuel loads, and the 1,000 variables that could mean the difference between a successful emergency landing and a smoking crater in the Atlantic. "Sir?" Rebecca appeared beside his seat, her face flushed with exertion, and barely controlled panic. "Are you by any chance a pilot?" The question hung between them like a bridge, one that Nathan could cross toward almost certain death, or refuse to cross toward equally certain death for everyone aboard Flight 789. He looked at Olivia, still struggling with her oxygen mask, her small fingers shaking with fear and confusion. "I'm sorry, baby girl," he whispered so softly that only she could hear. "Daddy has to break a promise." He stood up. "Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Hayes, United States Air Force," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of command. "Fighter pilot, 15 years active duty. I can help." The transformation was instantaneous and startling. The quiet, humble man who had endured Astrid Sterling's mockery vanished, replaced by someone whose very presence seemed to change the air pressure in the cabin. His shoulders straightened, his voice deepened, and suddenly every passenger within earshot was looking at him with expressions of hope and awe. Astrid Sterling's mouth fell open in shock. This was the same man she had dismissed as charity case, the struggling single father who couldn't afford proper clothes. The military bearing was unmistakable now that he wasn't hiding it the way he held himself, the calm certainty in his voice, the invisible aura of competence that surrounded him like armor. "Daddy." Olivia looked up at him with confused pride. "You're going to fly the airplane." Nathan knelt beside her seat, his hands gentle on her small shoulders. "That's right, sweetheart. Remember what I used to tell you about Daddy's old job? Well, sometimes the skills we learn never really go away." "But you promised Mama." Olivia's voice broke, and Nathan felt his heart shatter and reassemble itself in the space of a single heartbeat. "I know what I promised," he said softly. "But sometimes promises have to change when people need help. Your mama would understand." Olivia nodded solemnly, her 7-year-old wisdom somehow grasping the magnitude of the moment. "Will you come back to me?" The question nearly destroyed him. Nathan gathered her into his arms, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the lingering sweetness of the airplane cookies she'd eaten earlier. "I will always come back to you," he whispered. "Always." Rebecca was already moving, clearing a path toward the cockpit. "This way, Colonel Hayes. The captain is waiting." As Nathan stood to follow her, he felt a hand on his arm. He turned to find Astrid Sterling standing beside him, her face pale but determined. She began, then stopped, struggling with words that seemed inadequate. "I owe you an apology. And thank you." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, seeing past the expensive clothes and imperious manner to the frightened woman beneath. "Save the thanks until we're on the ground," he said quietly. "And take care of Olivia, if—" "Don't," Astrid interrupted, surprising herself with the fierceness in her voice. "Don't you dare give up before you've even started. You're going to bring us home." The confidence in her voice was remarkable, considering that an hour ago she had been mocking his very presence on the aircraft. But crisis had a way of stripping away pretense, revealing the essential truth of who people really were beneath their carefully constructed facades. Nathan nodded once, then turned to follow Rebecca toward the cockpit. As he walked through the cabin, passengers reached out to touch him, hands grasping at his jacket, voices whispering prayers and encouragement. He had become their hope, their salvation, the thin line between life and certain death. The cockpit door opened to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Captain Collins, a silver-haired veteran with 30 years of commercial flying experience, looked up from his instruments with relief and desperation warring in his eyes. In the co-pilot's seat, First Officer Martinez was unconscious, his head lolled back at an unnatural angle, medical equipment already attached to monitor his vital signs. "Heart attack," Collins explained tersely as Nathan slipped into the jump seat behind them. "Massive coronary about 10 minutes ago. We've got multiple system failures, hydraulic problems, and we're losing altitude. I need someone who can handle high-performance aircraft under extreme stress." Nathan's eyes swept across the instrument panel, his trained mind instantly cataloging the cascade of failures that were threatening to bring down Flight 789. Engine number 2 was running hot, indicating possible turbine damage. The hydraulic system was operating at less than 50% capacity, making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. Worst of all, they were burning fuel at nearly twice the normal rate, meaning their options for emergency landing sites were shrinking by the minute. "What's our current position?" Nathan asked, already reaching for the co-pilot's headset. "About 400 miles west of Ireland. Shannon Airport is our best option, but at current fuel consumption, it's going to be close." Nathan slipped on the headset and immediately felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him. This was different from his F-16, different from the single-seat fighters where his life was the only one at stake. Behind him, 200 souls were depending on skills he had promised his dying wife he would never use again. "Tower, this is Flight 789. Nathan spoke into the microphone, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We have an emergency situation. First officer is down and we're experiencing multiple system failures. Request priority handling and emergency services on standby." And the response was immediate. "Flight 789 Shannon Tower, we have you on radar. Emergency services are being positioned. What is the nature of your emergency?" As Nathan began to relay their situation to air traffic control, he was dimly aware of Captain Collins explaining the controls and systems that differed from military aircraft. But his mind was already working at a level beyond conscious thought, drawing on 15 years of training and combat experience to solve the three-dimensional puzzle of bringing a crippled aircraft safely to ground. Behind them, through the reinforced cockpit door, he could hear the sounds of fear and prayer from the passenger cabin. Somewhere in that chaos, Olivia was waiting for him to keep his promise to come back to her. Astrid Sterling, the woman who had mocked him an hour ago, was now trusting him with her life. The weight of it all should have been crushing. Instead, Nathan Hayes felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the pure crystalline clarity of purpose. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was born to do. The aircraft bucked violently as they hit another pocket of turbulence, and warning alarms screamed their electronic panic throughout the cockpit. Nathan's hands moved to the controls, with the unconscious precision of muscle memory, making minute adjustments that helped stabilize their flight path. "How the hell did you know to do that?" Collins asked, his voice filled with professional admiration. Nathan's answer was lost in the roar of failing engines and the distant sound of prayers being whispered in a dozen languages. Outside the cockpit windows, the North Atlantic stretched endlessly in all directions, cold and unforgiving, and utterly indifferent to the drama playing out in the thin metal tube that carried 200 human lives through the uncaring sky. The real battle for Flight 789 was just beginning, and Nathan Hayes was no longer the humble maintenance worker who had been mocked in business class. He was Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Hayes, fighter pilot, and he had a promise to keep to a 7-year-old girl who believed her daddy could do anything. The question was whether belief would be enough to overcome the laws of physics and the brutal mathematics of mechanical failure. In the next hour, they would all find out. The question was whether belief would be enough to overcome the laws of physics and the brutal mathematics of mechanical failure. In the next hour, they would all find out. Nathan's hands moved across the controls with a fluidity that spoke of thousands of hours in the cockpit, but these weren't the responsive controls of an F-16 Falcon. This was a massive commercial airliner wounded and fighting him at every turn. The hydraulic failure meant that every input required 3 times the normal force, and the damaged engine was creating an asymmetric thrust that wanted to pull them into a deadly spiral. "Fuel flow to Engine 2 is erratic," Captain Collins reported, his voice tight with controlled tension. "Temperatures climbing into the red zone." Nathan's eyes swept across the engine parameters displayed on the multifunction screen before him. The numbers told a story of cascading failure, metal fatigue, bearing seizure, the kind of catastrophic breakdown that could turn a turbofan engine into a bomb at 35,000 feet. "We need to shut it down," Nathan said, his fingers already moving toward the engine fire suppression system. "If that turbine lets go, it could take out the wing." "But we'll lose too much altitude," Collins protested. "We're already below our optimal flight level, and with only one engine, we'll make it work." Nathan interrupted, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had faced impossible odds before. "Trust me." The engine shutdown procedure on a commercial airliner was nothing like the emergency protocols Nathan had trained on in military aircraft, but the underlying principles were the same. Fuel flow, electrical systems, fire suppression, each step had to be executed with precision while maintaining control of an increasingly unstable aircraft. As Nathan's hand moved to the engine cutoff switch, Captain Collins grabbed his wrist. "If we're wrong about this, if we shut down a good engine, we all die." Nathan looked into the older pilot's eyes and saw his own fears reflected there. 200 lives, including his daughter's, hanging in the balance of a split-second decision. But the engine temperature gauge was climbing steadily into the danger zone, and the vibration readings indicated imminent mechanical failure. "We're already dying," Nathan said quietly. "This just gives us a chance to control how." He pulled the cutoff switch. Engine number 2 spooled down with a mechanical wail that sounded like grief itself, and Flight 789 immediately began to lose altitude. The asymmetric thrust from the remaining engine tried to roll them into a banking turn that could quickly become an unrecoverable spiral, but Nathan was ready for it. His left hand worked the rudder pedals, while his right adjusted the aileron trim, fighting the aircraft's natural tendency toward disaster. "Shannon Tower Flight 789. Nathan spoke into his headset, his voice steady despite the aircraft's increasingly violent movements. "We've shut down engine number 2 due to overheating, declaring emergency status and requesting immediate clearance to Shannon Airport." The Irish controller's accent carried across the static with professional calm. "Flight 789 Shannon Tower, we copy your emergency. You're cleared direct to Shannon Runway 06. Emergency services are standing by. What's your current altitude and rate of descent?" Nathan checked the altimeter, its needle spinning counterclockwise like a countdown clock. "Passing through 28,000 feet descent rate, approximately 800 feet per minute." The numbers were manageable, but barely. At their current rate of descent, and with their reduced airspeed, they would reach Shannon Airport with perhaps 10 minutes of fuel remaining, assuming nothing else went wrong. In aviation, assuming nothing else would go wrong was usually a fatal mistake. Behind them in the passenger cabin, the reality of their situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The dramatic change in engine noise, the steep descent, and the aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior had pushed many passengers beyond fear into something approaching panic. Astrid Sterling found herself in the strange position of trying to comfort Olivia Hayes, the daughter of a man she had spent the first hour of the flight mocking and humiliating. The little girl was clutching her unicorn backpack with white knuckles, her eyes wide with terror as she tried to understand why her father had left her alone with strangers. "When is Daddy coming back?" Olivia asked for the 10th time, her small voice barely audible above the mechanical groaning of the aircraft's stressed airframe. Astrid, who had built her empire on decisive action and clear communication, found herself struggling for words that could comfort a frightened child. Her own childhood had been devoid of such moments. Nannies and boarding schools had insulated her from the raw vulnerability that Olivia was experiencing. "Your daddy is helping to fly the airplane," Astrid said, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. "He's very brave and he knows what he's doing." "But what if—" Olivia began, then stopped as if voicing her fears might make them real. "What if what, sweetheart? What if something happens to Daddy, then I won't have anybody left?" The simple statement hit Astrid like a physical blow. In her world of corporate mergers and hostile takeovers, she had forgotten that such pure vulnerability existed. This 7-year-old girl who had already lost her mother was now facing the possibility of losing her father while helpless to do anything but wait. "Listen to me," Astrid said, turning in her seat to face Olivia directly. "Your daddy is the best pilot on this airplane. He's going to bring us all home safely, and then you're going to give him the biggest hug in the world." "Promise?" Astrid hesitated. In her business dealings, she never made promises she couldn't guarantee. But looking into Olivia's trusting eyes, she found herself saying words that had no basis in financial projections or risk analysis. "I promise." The aircraft lurched violently to starboard, and several passengers screamed. Through the small windows, the ocean below looked impossibly vast and unforgiving. At this altitude, the water would be like concrete if they hit it, and the survival time in the North Atlantic's frigid waters could be measured in minutes. In the cockpit, Nathan was fighting a battle that grew more desperate with each passing moment. The remaining engine was running hot, not critically so, but enough to suggest that their margin for error was evaporating along with their fuel. Worse, the hydraulic system failure was becoming more pronounced, making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. We're losing hydraulic pressure in the primary system, Captain Collins reported, his voice tight with concern. Manual reversion is going to be a nightmare at landing speeds. Nathan nodded grimly. Manual reversion meant that the flight controls would require enormous physical force to operate, turning the landing approach into a wrestling match between human strength and aerodynamic forces. He had trained for such scenarios in the military, but never in an aircraft this size, never with this many lives at stake. Shannon Tower Flight 789, Nathan called. Be advised we're experiencing hydraulic failure in addition to our engine problems. Request emergency vehicles and crash rescue equipment standing by. Flight 789 Shannon. All emergency services are positioned and ready. Can you give us your estimated time of arrival? Nathan quickly calculated their current position, airspeed, and rate of descent. The mathematics were unforgiving. They would arrive at Shannon Airport with perhaps 5 minutes of fuel remaining, assuming the remaining engine continued to function properly. Estimate arrival in 32 minutes, Nathan replied. We're going to need a straight-in approach to runway 06. No time for standard approach patterns. Roger, Flight 789, you're cleared for straight-in approach runway 06. Wind is currently 100 degrees at 15 knots. Altimeter setting 2985. As Nathan acknowledged the clearance, he became aware of a new vibration through the aircraft's structure, a subtle but growing tremor that suggested additional mechanical problems. The wounded airliner was literally shaking itself apart, and they still had 30 minutes of flight time ahead of them. Collins, Nathan said, his voice calm despite the circumstances. I need you to go back to the cabin. Check on the passengers, make sure everyone's secured for emergency landing. And there's a little girl in business class seat 4A. Her name is Olivia. Tell her daddy's doing fine. Captain Collins looked at Nathan with a mixture of admiration and concern. You sure you can handle this alone? Nathan's hands moved across the controls with unconscious precision, maintaining their heading and altitude despite the aircraft's best efforts to fall out of the sky. I've been alone in worse situations, he said quietly. Go take care of the passengers. As Collins left the cockpit, Nathan found himself truly alone with Flight 789 for the first time. The silence was profound, broken only by the mechanical sounds of a dying aircraft and the steady whisper of air flowing past the fuselage. Through the cockpit windows, he could see the Irish coastline beginning to emerge from the haze, still distant but close enough to represent hope. He thought of Sarah, of the promise he had made in that sterile hospital room. She had been so weak by then, her voice barely a whisper, but her concern for Olivia's future had been absolute. Promise me you won't take risks, she had said. Olivia needs her father more than the world needs another hero. But what was he supposed to do when heroism was the only option? When the choice was between breaking a promise to the dead or betraying the living, Sarah would understand, he told himself. She had to understand. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time, and Nathan felt something fundamental shift in the flight characteristics. The nose wanted to drop despite his inputs on the elevator, and the artificial horizon showed a slight but persistent bank to the left. Something was wrong with the flight control system beyond the hydraulic problems they already knew about. Shannon Tower Flight 789, he called, his voice betraying none of the concern he felt. We're experiencing additional control problems. Request priority handling and suggest you scramble emergency aircraft for escort. The controller's response was immediate. Flight 789, understand additional problems. Irish Air Corps is launching 2 fighter aircraft for escort. They'll be with you in 15 minutes. Fighter escort. Nathan almost smiled at the irony. 15 years ago, he would have been one of those pilots racing to assist an aircraft in distress. Now he was the one who needed assistance, flying a machine that seemed determined to destroy itself before they could reach safety. In the passenger cabin, the mood had shifted from panic to a strange kind of desperate calm. People were writing notes to loved ones, recording messages on their phones, saying prayers in languages from around the world. The universal human response to imminent mortality, the need to leave something behind to matter in the face of oblivion. Captain Collins moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, checking seatbelts and ensuring that passengers were prepared for emergency landing procedures. When he reached Olivia's seat, he found her coloring furiously in her princess book, as if the act of creation could somehow ward off the destruction that seemed to be approaching. Hi there, Collins said gently, kneeling beside her seat. I'm Captain Collins. I've been working with your daddy in the cockpit. Olivia looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for her 7 years. Is Daddy okay? Your daddy is doing an amazing job, Collins said, and it was absolutely true. In 30 years of commercial flying, he had never seen anyone handle an emergency with such calm competence. He asked me to tell you that he's doing fine and that he loves you very much. I know he loves me, Olivia said with simple certainty. He tells me every day. Even when he's sad about Mama, he still tells me. Collins felt something tighten in his chest. This little girl, who had already lost one parent, was now facing the possibility of losing another. The unfairness of it was staggering, but children had a way of accepting unfairness that adults had forgotten. Your daddy is going to bring us home, Collins said, echoing Astrid Sterling's earlier promise. You just keep coloring and before you know it, we'll be on the ground. As Collins moved on to check other passengers, Astrid found herself studying Olivia with new eyes. The child's calm acceptance, her unshakable faith in her father's abilities, represented something that Astrid had lost so long ago she had forgotten it ever existed. When had she stopped believing that problems could be solved, that heroes existed, that love could conquer fear? The answer came to her with painful clarity when she was about Olivia's age, when her own father had missed her school play because of a business meeting, when her mother had explained that success required sacrifices, that emotional attachments were luxuries they couldn't afford. She had learned those lessons well, had built an empire on the foundation of emotional detachment. But now, watching a 7-year-old girl color pictures while her father fought to save 200 lives, Astrid began to understand what those lessons had cost her. Olivia, she said softly, can you tell me about your daddy? The little girl looked up, her face brightening despite their circumstances. Daddy is the best daddy in the whole world. He makes me pancakes that look like butterflies, and he reads me stories with different voices for all the characters. And when I have nightmares about Mama being gone, he lets me sleep in his bed until I feel better. Each detail was like a small revelation to Astrid, offering glimpses of a life built around love rather than achievement. What kind of work does he do? He fixes airplanes, Olivia said with obvious pride. He says airplanes are like big birds, and when they get hurt, he helps them fly again. He used to fly airplanes too before I was born, but he stopped when Mama got sick. The pieces were falling into place in Astrid's mind. Nathan Hayes wasn't just a maintenance worker. He was a former pilot who had given up flying to care for his ailing wife and young daughter. The sacrifice implicit in that decision was staggering, and it made her earlier cruelty even more unforgivable. The aircraft lurched again more severely this time, and the lights flickered. In the cockpit, Nathan was fighting an increasingly desperate battle against mechanical failure and the laws of physics. The flight control problems were worsening, and he was having to use more and more muscle to keep the aircraft level and on course. Through his headset, he could hear the Irish Air Corps fighters making contact with Shannon Tower, reporting that they had Flight 789 in sight. The presence of the escort aircraft was both comforting and ominous. Comforting because help was nearby, ominous because their very presence confirmed the severity of the situation. Flight 789, this is Shamrock Leader, came a crisp voice over the radio. We have you in sight. Your aircraft appears to be trailing fluid from the left wing. Nathan's blood ran cold. Fluid from the left wing meant hydraulic fluid, which meant their already compromised flight control system was continuing to deteriorate. He looked out the left window and could see a fine mist streaming from somewhere near the wing root, precious hydraulic fluid that represented their ability to control the aircraft. Shamrock Leader Flight 789, Nathan replied. Confirm hydraulic leak. We're losing system pressure rapidly. The implications were staggering. Without hydraulic pressure, the flight controls would become completely manual, requiring enormous physical strength to operate. At landing speeds with the aircraft's weight and the forces involved, it might be impossible for one person to maintain control. Nathan made a decision that went against every instinct developed over 15 years of military flying. He activated the aircraft's intercom system and spoke directly to the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Lieutenant Colonel Hayes speaking from the cockpit. I need to be completely honest with you about our situation. We're experiencing multiple mechanical failures, and our approach to Shannon Airport is going to be challenging. I need everyone to follow the flight attendant's instructions exactly and prepare for a rough landing. He paused, thinking of Olivia, of the promise he had made to always come back to her. I want you all to know that I have every intention of getting us safely on the ground. We're going to make it through this together. The words carried through the cabin like a benediction, and somehow, despite the aircraft's deteriorating condition and the very real possibility of disaster, passengers found themselves believing him. There was something in Nathan Hayes' voice, a quiet authority, an unshakable determination that inspired confidence even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the cockpit, Nathan was running through emergency procedures with the methodical precision of a man who had faced death before and survived. The approach to Shannon Airport would require every skill he had developed over 15 years of military flying, plus some he would have to invent on the spot. The aircraft's condition continued to deteriorate with each passing minute. The hydraulic leak was worsening. The remaining engine was running hotter than normal, and the flight controls were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. But through it all, Nathan Hayes remained calm, focused, determined. He had made 2 promises in his life that truly mattered, one to his dying wife, one to his living daughter. The first promise he had already broken. The second promise, to always come back to her, he was determined to keep no matter what it cost him. 20 minutes to Shannon Airport. 20 minutes to prove that heroes didn't always wear uniforms, that sometimes they wore faded jackets and carried unicorn backpacks, that love could indeed conquer the cold mathematics of mechanical failure. The battle for Flight 789 was far from over, but Nathan Hayes was just getting started. The battle for Flight 789 was far from over, but Nathan Hayes was just getting started. Through the cockpit windows, Shannon Airport was beginning to take shape on the horizon, a collection of lights against the Irish countryside that represented salvation, if they could reach it, tragedy if they couldn't. Nathan's hands moved constantly across the controls, making minute adjustments to compensate for the aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior. The hydraulic leak had worsened to the point where the flight controls felt like they were made of concrete, requiring every ounce of his strength just to maintain level flight. Shamrock leader to Flight 789. The Irish fighter pilot's voice crackled through the radio. Your hydraulic leak is getting worse. We can see fluid streaming from multiple points on your left wing. Nathan's jaw tightened. Multiple leaks meant the entire hydraulic system was failing catastrophically. Soon he would be flying a massive commercial airliner with nothing but muscle power and prayer to keep it airborne. He had trained for such scenarios in military aircraft, but those had been single-seat fighters, weighing a fraction of what Flight 789 carried. Flight 789 copies. Nathan replied, his voice betraying none of the concern he felt. How's our approach looking? You're lined up perfectly for runway 06. Shannon Tower has cleared all other traffic. The entire airport is yours. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere had evolved beyond panic into something approaching spiritual acceptance. People who had been strangers hours earlier were now holding hands, sharing stories, offering comfort to those who needed it most. The proximity of death had stripped away the artificial barriers that normally separated human beings, revealing the fundamental truth that in the face of mortality, all people were equal. Captain Collins had returned to the cockpit, his face grim with the knowledge of what he had seen in the cabin. Everyone's as ready as they can be, he reported. Flight attendants have gone through emergency procedures 3 times. Passengers are in brace position. Nathan nodded without taking his eyes off the instruments. The altitude was dropping steadily, 15,000 feet, and descending. At their current rate, they would reach Shannon in 12 minutes. 12 minutes to thread the needle between mechanical failure and safe landing, between keeping his promise to Olivia and breaking it forever. Collins, Nathan said quietly, I need you to understand something. When we start the final approach, this aircraft is going to fight me every inch of the way. If I tell you to take the controls, don't argue, just do it. You think you might not be able to handle it. Nathan's hands worked the sluggish controls, feeling the aircraft's reluctance to respond to his inputs. I think we're about to find out what happens when 200 tons of metal tries to land without proper flight controls. And I think we're going to need every advantage we can get. The Irish coastline was clearly visible now. Green fields dotted with tiny villages, whose inhabitants had no idea that their evening was about to be interrupted by an aviation emergency. Nathan could see the lighthouse at Loop Head, a navigation landmark he had memorized during his pre-flight briefing a lifetime ago. Shannon Tower Flight 789, Nathan called. We're 12 miles out, beginning final approach. Be advised we may not be able to execute a go-around if this approach doesn't work. The controller's response carried the weight of understanding. Flight 789 Shannon. Understood. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Runway is clear and ready. In the cabin, Astrid Sterling found herself in a position she had never imagined, providing emotional support to a frightened child while confronting her own mortality. The irony wasn't lost on her that the little girl she was now comforting was the daughter of the man she had spent the first hour of the flight humiliating. Miss Astrid, Olivia said, using the name she had given herself when introductions became necessary. Do you think Daddy is scared? The question was so innocent, so direct, that Astrid felt tears threatening for the first time in years. I think your daddy is very brave, she said carefully, and I think he's fighting very hard to bring us home safely. He always fights hard for me, Olivia said with simple faith. When Mama was sick, he fought to make her better. When the mean boys at school made fun of my second-hand clothes, he fought to make me feel better. Daddy always fights for the people he loves. The words hit Astrid like physical blows, each one a reminder of the emotional poverty of her own life. When was the last time someone had fought for her? When was the last time she had fought for someone else, really fought, not just engaged in business warfare, but genuinely cared about another person's well-being? The aircraft bucked violently and several passengers screamed. Through the small window, Astrid could see the ground approaching at what seemed like an alarming rate. But Olivia just clutched her coloring book tighter and continued working on her princess picture, adding purple flowers to the princess's garden with the focused concentration of childhood. Aren't you scared? Astrid asked, genuinely curious. Olivia considered the question seriously. I'm a little scared, she admitted. But Daddy taught me that being scared is okay as long as you don't let it stop you from doing what's right. And Daddy is doing what's right. The simple wisdom of the statement left Astrid speechless. This 7-year-old child, who had already endured more loss than many adults, possessed a moral clarity that Astrid had somehow lost along her climb to success. When had she stopped caring about what was right and started caring only about what was profitable? In the cockpit, Nathan was fighting the most difficult battle of his flying career. The aircraft was now almost completely without hydraulic assistance, making every control input a wrestling match between human determination and aerodynamic forces. His arms ached from the constant effort and sweat poured down his face, despite the cool air conditioning. 10 miles out, he reported to Shannon Tower. Beginning descent to final approach altitude. The ground was rushing up to meet them now. Green Irish fields giving way to the geometric patterns of civilization. Nathan could see cars pulling over on the highways below their drivers, drawn by the unusual sight of a commercial airliner being escorted by military fighters. Flight 789, you're looking good, Shamrock Leader reported. Right on the glide slope, we'll stay with you until you're on the ground. Nathan appreciated the support, but he knew that when it came to the actual landing, he would be completely alone. The fighter pilots could observe, they could offer encouragement, but they couldn't reach through the radio and help him wrestle the controls of a dying airliner. At 8 miles out, disaster struck. The remaining engine began to surge and stutter, its temperature readings climbing rapidly into the danger zone. Nathan's eyes swept across the engine instruments with the trained precision of 15 years of emergency procedures, and what he saw there made his blood turn to ice. Shannon Tower Flight 789. He called, his voice steady despite the catastrophic implications of what he was seeing. We're experiencing engine failure on our remaining engine. We may not be able to maintain altitude. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Then Shannon Tower responded with professional calm that barely concealed the desperation of their situation. Flight 789 understood. You're cleared to land any runway, any direction. Emergency services are ready. Nathan's hands moved across the cockpit with automatic precision, implementing emergency procedures for total engine failure. But his mind was calculating the brutal mathematics of their situation 8 miles from the runway, losing altitude rapidly with no engine power and virtually no flight control authority. In conventional aviation wisdom, they were already dead. "Collins," Nathan said quietly, "get on the cabin address system. Tell them we're going to make it." Captain Collins stared at him in disbelief. "But the engine, we've lost all power." "Tell them we're going to make it." Nathan repeated, his voice carrying absolute authority. "They need to hear confidence, not fear." Collins activated the intercom with shaking hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Collins. We've experienced some additional mechanical difficulties, but Lieutenant Colonel Hayes has everything under control. Please remain in your seats and maintain brace position. We'll be on the ground shortly." The announcement rippled through the cabin, and somehow, despite the aircraft's obvious distress, passengers found themselves believing it. There was something about the calm professionalism in Collins's voice, something about the unwavering competence they sensed from the man in the cockpit, that inspired confidence even in the face of impossible odds. Nathan was flying the aircraft now on pure instinct and 15 years of accumulated skill. Without engine power, he was essentially piloting a very large, very heavy glider. The only energy he had was altitude, and he was trading that altitude for distance toward the runway in a careful dance that would either end in triumph or tragedy. 6 miles out, he reported. We're established on final approach. Through the cockpit windows, Shannon Airport was clearly visible, now the runway lights stretching out like a pathway to salvation. But Nathan could see that their glide path was too shallow. They were coming in too low, and without engine power, he had no way to correct their trajectory. Shamrock leader to Flight 789. The fighter pilot's voice carried new urgency. You're below the glide slope. Recommend immediate power application. No power available, Nathan replied tersely. We're committed to this approach. What he didn't say was that they were committed to much more than just this approach. They were committed to a landing attempt that defied every principle of safe aviation, an approach that would require perfection from both pilot and aircraft at a moment when neither was capable of providing it. In the cabin, passengers could sense the change in the aircraft's behavior. The nose was pitched down more steeply, the speed was increasing, and through the windows, the ground seemed to be rushing up at an alarming rate. Some people began to pray more loudly. Others wrote final messages to loved ones, but most simply held on and trusted in the quiet competence of the man in the cockpit. Astrid Sterling found herself gripping Olivia's small hand with desperate intensity, drawing comfort from the child's unshakable faith in her father's abilities. The little girl had stopped coloring and was now looking out the window with wide eyes, but there was no fear in her expression, only curiosity and complete trust. Are we going to crash? Olivia asked with the direct honesty of childhood. Astrid looked into those innocent brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what mattered in life. This child, who had already lost so much, deserved truth, but she also deserved hope. Your daddy is the best pilot in the sky, Astrid said, and for the first time in years, she meant every word she spoke. He's going to bring us home. Nathan was now flying entirely by feel, using instincts developed over thousands of hours in the cockpit to judge their approach angle and airspeed. The runway was growing larger in the windscreen, but he could see that they were still coming in too low. At this rate, they would impact the ground short of the runway, turning Flight 789 into a smoking crater in the Irish countryside. But Nathan Hayes had not survived 15 years of combat flying by accepting defeat. He had one last card to play, one final gambit that might give them the altitude they needed to reach the runway. He pulled back hard on the control yoke, trading their excess airspeed for precious altitude, in a maneuver that would have been suicidal in any other circumstances. The aircraft's nose pitched up sharply, and for a terrifying moment, Nathan felt the buffeting that indicated an approaching stall. Too much angle and the aircraft would fall out of the sky like a stone. Too little, and they would impact the ground short of the runway. The margin for error was measured in degrees of pitch attitude and knots of airspeed, and Nathan was balancing on the knife's edge between both extremes. "Come on," he whispered to the aircraft as if it were a living thing that could respond to encouragement. "Come on, just a little more." The runway threshold passed beneath them with perhaps 10 feet to spare, and suddenly they were over the concrete strip that represented safety. But their ordeal was far from over. Without engine power, Nathan had no ability to execute a go-around if the landing attempt failed. This approach would end either in a successful landing or in disaster. There were no other options. 50 feet, Collins called out, reading the radio altimeter. 40 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet. Nathan's hands were locked on the control yoke with desperate intensity, using every ounce of his strength to hold the aircraft's nose up as they descended toward the runway. The ground was rushing up to meet them at over 100 miles per hour, and without proper flight controls, he had limited ability to flare the aircraft for a gentle touchdown. 10 feet, 5 feet. Flight 789 hit the runway like a falling anvil, the main landing gear impacting the concrete with a violence that sent shockwaves through the entire airframe. Passengers screamed as they were thrown against their restraints, and for a terrifying moment it seemed as if the aircraft might bounce back into the air beyond Nathan's ability to control. But the wheels stayed on the runway, and Nathan immediately applied maximum braking and reverse thrust from the failed engines. The aircraft began to slow, but they were still traveling at tremendous speed down a runway that was rapidly running out of real estate. "Emergency, stop! Emergency, stop!" Nathan called into his radio. "We're not going to be able to stop before the end of the runway." The runway at Shannon Airport was 8,000 feet long, more than adequate for normal landings. But Flight 789 was not executing a normal landing. They were a runaway freight train of aluminum and human cargo, and the mathematics of momentum were working against them with unforgiving precision. Nathan stood on the brake pedals with all his weight, feeling the heat building in the brake systems as they fought to dissipate the enormous kinetic energy of the speeding aircraft. Through the cockpit windows, he could see the end of the runway approaching with terrifying inevitability. "Come on," he whispered again. "Come on, just stop." The aircraft was slowing, but too slowly. Nathan could see the runway overrun area ahead, the grass and dirt that might provide additional stopping distance if they were lucky, or might send them tumbling into a fiery crash if they weren't. 3,000 feet from the end of the runway, something miraculous happened. The aircraft's speed dropped below critical levels, and Nathan felt the brakes finally gaining the upper hand over momentum. The end of the runway was still approaching, but at a manageable speed now, and Nathan began to believe that they might actually survive this landing. 2,000 feet. 1,000 feet. 500 feet. Flight 789 rolled to a complete stop just 200 feet from the end of runway 06 at Shannon Airport, its passengers alive, its crew intact, and its cargo of human dreams and fears delivered safely to Irish soil. For a moment, the only sound in the cockpit was the quiet ticking of cooling metal and Nathan's ragged breathing. Then Captain Collins broke the silence. "I don't believe it," he whispered. "I don't fucking believe it." Nathan's hands were shaking as he reached for his seatbelt, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the emergency finally giving way to exhaustion. Through the cockpit windows, he could see emergency vehicles racing toward them, their red and blue lights painting the evening sky with celebration rather than mourning. But more importantly, through the reinforced cockpit door, he could hear something that made every moment of terror worthwhile. The sound of passengers cheering, crying, laughing, with the pure joy of unexpected survival. And somewhere in that celebration, a 7-year-old girl named Olivia Hayes was waiting for her daddy to come home. And somewhere in that celebration, a 7-year-old girl named Olivia Hayes was waiting for her daddy to come home. Nathan's hands trembled as he unbuckled his harness, 15 years of military training, finally giving way to the overwhelming relief of a father who had kept his promise. The cockpit felt smaller now, intimate in the way that shared survival could make any space feel like home. Captain Collins was already on the radio with Shannon Tower reporting their safe arrival with a voice thick with emotion, but Nathan barely heard the words. All he could think about was the small face that would be looking for him in the cabin, brown eyes that trusted him to always come back. The aircraft had finally fallen silent, its engines cooling with metallic pings and sighs, like a warrior laying down arms after battle. Through the cockpit windows, Nathan could see the emergency vehicles surrounding them in a protective circle, their lights painting the Irish evening in shades of red and gold. But it was the lights inside the cabin that mattered most, the lights that meant 200 souls were breathing, talking, crying, with the profound joy of unexpected life. "Colonel," Collins said, his voice breaking slightly on the title, "I've been flying for 30 years and I've never seen anything like what you just did." Nathan shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the cockpit door that separated him from his daughter. "I just brought my little girl home," he said quietly. Everything else was just details. As Nathan stood to leave the cockpit, Collins caught his arm. "The media is going to want to talk to you. There are probably cameras out there already. You're going to be famous after this." "I don't want to be famous," Nathan replied without hesitation. "I want to have dinner with my daughter and read her a bedtime story. That's all I've ever wanted." The cockpit door opened like a gateway between two worlds, the world of technical expertise and life or death decisions, and the world of unicorn backpacks and coloring books and unconditional love. Nathan stepped through that gateway and into a chaos of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. The passengers were on their feet, despite the flight attendant's requests to remain seated, and as Nathan emerged from the cockpit, a silence fell over the cabin that was more profound than any applause could have been. These people, strangers who had shared the most terrifying hour of their lives, looked at him with expressions that ranged from awe to gratitude to something approaching reverence. But Nathan's eyes found only one face in the crowd. "Daddy!" Olivia's voice cut through the silence like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and she was running down the aisle before anyone could stop her, her unicorn backpack bouncing against her small frame, her coloring book clutched in one hand like a talisman that had somehow helped keep her father safe. Nathan dropped to one knee in the narrow aisle, and Olivia crashed into his arms with the force of pure love, her small body trembling with relief and joy, and the absolute certainty that her daddy always kept his promises. He held her with desperate intensity, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the lingering sweetness of airplane cookies, feeling her heartbeat against his chest like a reminder of everything that mattered in the world. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered against his shoulder. "I knew you wouldn't leave me." "Never." Nathan whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "I will never leave you, baby girl. Never." The moment stretched between them, father and daughter reunited in the aftermath of crisis, surrounded by strangers who had become witnesses to the power of love to overcome impossible odds. But it was Astrid Sterling who broke the spell, stepping forward from her seat with tears streaming down her face and her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. "Mr. Hayes," she began, then stopped, struggling with words that seemed inadequate to the moment. I need to apologize for what I said earlier, for how I treated you and your daughter. I was wrong about everything." Nathan looked up at her, still holding Olivia in his arms, and saw something in her eyes that he recognized, the look of someone who had just discovered that everything they thought they knew about the world was incomplete. It was the look Sarah had worn during her final days, when pain had stripped away everything superficial and left only truth behind. "You don't need to apologize," Nathan said gently. "We all say things we don't mean when we're scared or hurting." "But I wasn't scared then," Astrid protested. "I was just cruel for no reason except that I could be." She looked down at Olivia, who was studying her with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Your daughter defended you when I was being horrible. She has more grace than I've shown in years." Olivia looked up at her father with questioning eyes. "Daddy, Miss Astrid took care of me when you were flying the airplane. She held my hand when I was scared, and she promised you would come back." Nathan's expression softened as he looked at Astrid with new understanding. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for taking care of her." The gratitude in his voice was like a physical blow to Astrid, who had spent the last hour confronting the emptiness of her own life, while watching this man risk everything for his daughter. She had built an empire, commanded respect, accumulated wealth beyond most people's dreams, but she had never experienced the kind of love that had motivated Nathan Hayes to break his promise to his dying wife in order to save his living daughter. "I don't deserve your thanks," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't deserve anything after how I behaved." "We all deserve forgiveness," Nathan replied, getting to his feet but keeping one arm around Olivia. "That's what my wife used to say." Sarah believed that people were fundamentally good, that sometimes they just forgot how to show it. The mention of his wife's name seemed to illuminate something in Nathan's face, a warmth that spoke of love that transcended death. Astrid found herself thinking about her own life, about the relationships she had sacrificed for success, about the love she had rejected as weakness. "Tell me about her," Astrid said impulsively. "Tell me about Sarah." Nathan's smile was radiant with memory and loss. She was a kindergarten teacher. She believed that every child could learn that every person could change, that love was stronger than fear or anger or greed. She saw the best in everyone, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. He looked down at Olivia, who was listening with the solemn attention she always gave to stories about her mother. "She would have liked you, Miss Sterling. She would have seen past the surface to the person underneath." The words hit Astrid like a revelation. For years, she had told herself that emotional connections were luxuries she couldn't afford, that success required a certain ruthlessness that precluded genuine relationships. But listening to Nathan speak about his wife, seeing the love that surrounded him and his daughter like an invisible shield, she began to understand what she had really sacrificed in her climb to the top. Around them, other passengers were beginning to move toward the exits, guided by flight attendants and emergency personnel. The initial euphoria of survival was giving way to the practical concerns of deplaning, of contacting loved ones, of processing what they had just experienced. But a small group had gathered around Nathan, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had made Astrid question her own assumptions about success and worth. An elderly man with kind eyes stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. "Son, I don't know how to thank you. I've got grandchildren I wasn't sure I'd ever see again." A young mother holding a sleeping baby added her voice to the chorus of gratitude. "My husband is deployed overseas. If something had happened to us..." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Nathan understood. One by one, passengers approached to offer their thanks, their stories, their recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary. But Nathan deflected the praise with the same quiet grace he had shown throughout the crisis, redirecting attention to the crew, to the emergency responders, to anyone except himself. "I just did what needed to be done," he said repeatedly. Anyone would have done the same. But Astrid knew that wasn't true. She had spent her entire career around people in positions of power and responsibility, and she knew that very few of them would have risked everything for strangers. Nathan Hayes represented something rare in her world: genuine heroism without self-promotion, competence without arrogance, strength without cruelty. As the cabin finally began to empty, Astrid found herself alone with Nathan and Olivia near the aircraft's exit. The emergency slides had been deployed, and passengers were making their way down to the waiting buses that would transport them to the terminal. But Astrid hesitated, knowing that once she left this aircraft, she would return to her world of boardrooms and balance sheets, while Nathan would disappear back into the quiet anonymity he clearly preferred. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying an urgency she hadn't planned. "I know you probably want to get Olivia settled, but could we talk? Maybe tomorrow I'd like to buy you dinner. Both of you." Nathan studied her face, seeing something there that he recognized from his years of reading people in high-stress situations. Astrid Sterling was at a crossroads, facing the kind of choice that would define the rest of her life. He had seen the same look on soldiers who had to decide whether to re-enlist, on pilots who had to choose between safe assignments and dangerous missions, on people who had to decide whether to change or remain the same. "Olivia," he said, looking down at his daughter. "What do you think? Should we have dinner with Miss Astrid?" Olivia considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. "Is she going to be nicer this time?" The simple question hung in the air like a challenge, and Astrid felt her face flush with shame and something else, hope. This child, who had every reason to reject her after witnessing her earlier cruelty, was offering her a second chance. "I'm going to try to be the nicest I've ever been," Astrid said, kneeling down to Olivia's eye level. "I'm going to try to be the kind of person your daddy and your mama would be proud to know." Olivia nodded solemnly, then looked up at her father. "I think Mama would want us to help her learn how to be nice," she said, with the moral clarity that children possessed before the world complicated their understanding. Nathan felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even in death, Sarah continued to guide their lives through the lessons she had taught and the love she had modeled. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "We'll help Miss Astrid remember how to be nice." As they made their way toward the aircraft exit, Astrid found herself walking behind father and daughter, watching the easy intimacy of their relationship with something approaching wonder. Nathan's hand rested protectively on Olivia's shoulder while she chattered excitedly about the adventure they had just shared, already transforming terror into story with the resilience of childhood. "Daddy, when we tell Grandma Rose about this, can we tell her how you saved everyone?" "We can tell her how everyone worked together to keep each other safe," Nathan replied diplomatically. "But you were the one who flew the airplane when it was broken," Olivia insisted with the stubborn logic of 7-year-olds. "And Miss Rebecca and Captain Collins helped take care of everyone in the cabin," Nathan countered. "And Miss Astrid took care of you when I couldn't. Everyone did their part." Listening to this exchange, Astrid was struck by Nathan's determination to minimize his own role in their survival while elevating the contributions of others. In her world, people fought for credit-hoarded recognition, built personal brands around their achievements. Nathan Hayes seemed genuinely uncomfortable with praise, more interested in deflecting attention than claiming it. The evening air of Shannon Airport was cool and sweet after the recycled atmosphere of the aircraft, and Astrid breathed deeply as they descended the emergency slide. Around them, passengers were being reunited with luggage processed by immigration officials and gradually dispersed into the ordinary business of travel. But their shared experience had created bonds that would endure long after the bureaucratic details were resolved. Nathan was immediately surrounded by airport officials, airline representatives, and what appeared to be reporters who had somehow gained access to the secure area. Camera flashes illuminated the gathering dusk and microphones were thrust toward him with the aggressive hunger of modern media. "Colonel Hayes, can you tell us about the landing? How did you manage to control the aircraft without hydraulic power? What was going through your mind when you realized both engines had failed?" Nathan answered the questions with the same quiet competence he had shown in the cockpit, but Astrid could see the discomfort in his eyes the way he kept glancing toward Olivia, who was staying close to his side, but looking overwhelmed by the chaos. "Excuse me," Astrid said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Mr. Hayes and his daughter have been through enough tonight. They need some space." The reporters turned toward her with the scent of additional story, recognizing her face from business magazines and society pages. "Ms. Sterling, what's your connection to this story? Were you a passenger on Flight 789? "I was a passenger," Astrid confirmed, "and like everyone else on that aircraft, I owe my life to Colonel Hayes' skill and courage. But right now, this little girl needs dinner and a quiet place to process what she's been through. I'm sure Colonel Hayes will be happy to speak with you tomorrow after he's had time to rest." The reporters pressed for more details, but Astrid had navigated media scrums before, and she efficiently guided Nathan and Olivia through the crowd toward the terminal building. Behind them, cameras flashed and questions shouted, but they were moving toward something more important than fame. They were moving toward understanding. The Shannon Airport terminal felt like a sanctuary after the chaos outside, and Astrid led them to a quiet corner where they could sit and breathe and begin to process what they had experienced. Olivia climbed into her father's lap with the automatic comfort of a child who knew she was safe, while Nathan held her close with the desperate relief of a parent who had almost lost everything. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" Nathan asked, brushing a strand of hair from Olivia's forehead. "A little," she admitted, "but mostly I'm tired, and I want to call Grandma Rose and tell her we're okay." "We'll call her in a few minutes," Nathan promised. "But first, let's see if we can find something to eat." Astrid was already on her feet, her natural take-charge instincts overriding the uncertainty she felt about her role in their lives. "There's a restaurant upstairs. Nothing fancy, but they'll have food that's suitable for children. My treat, obviously." As they made their way through the terminal, Astrid found herself seeing the world through different eyes. The other travelers, the airport staff, the simple human interactions that she normally ignored, all of it seemed more vivid, more meaningful, as if her near-death experience had somehow sharpened her perception of life itself. The restaurant was nearly empty, just a few stranded passengers making the best of delayed flights and missed connections. They found a table in a quiet corner, and Astrid watched with fascination as Nathan helped Olivia navigate the menu, patiently explaining unfamiliar foods and ensuring she would find something she liked. "Can I have fish and chips?" Olivia asked. "I've never had Irish fish and chips." "Of course," Nathan said, then looked at Astrid. "Are you sure about this? Dinner doesn't have to be your responsibility." "It's not about responsibility," Astrid replied, and realized she meant it. "It's about... I'm not sure what it's about. But I know I don't want to say goodbye to you both and go back to my old life pretending this never happened." Nathan studied her face, and Astrid felt as if he could see straight through to her soul. It was an uncomfortable feeling for someone who had spent years perfecting the art of emotional camouflage, but also strangely liberating. "What is your old life like?" he asked gently. The question should have been simple to answer, but Astrid found herself struggling with concepts she had never questioned before. "Successful," she said finally. "Profitable. Efficient. Empty." The last word slipped out before she could stop it, and Olivia looked up from her coloring book with curious eyes. "What does empty mean?" Astrid looked at the little girl, then at her father, and felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been sealed away for so long she had forgotten it existed. "Empty means you have everything you thought you wanted, but you wake up every morning feeling like something important is missing," she said quietly. "Empty means you're surrounded by people who work for you, but you don't have anyone who cares if you're happy or sad or scared." "That sounds lonely," Olivia observed with the directness of childhood. "It is lonely," Astrid agreed. "Very lonely." Nathan reached across the table and touched her hand briefly, a gesture of comfort that was so natural and genuine that Astrid felt tears threatening again. "It doesn't have to stay that way," he said softly. "How do you change something like that? How do you learn to be human again?" "One day at a time," Nathan replied. "One choice at a time." Sarah used to say that every interaction with another person was a chance to practice love or practice selfishness. The more you practice love, the easier it becomes. "But I don't know how to practice love," Astrid admitted. "I don't even know what it looks like in real life." Olivia looked up from her coloring with the solemn wisdom that sometimes emerged from children when adults needed it most. "Love looks like Daddy working extra jobs so we could sit together on the airplane. Love looks like Daddy flying the broken airplane even though he was scared. Love looks like you holding my hand when I was frightened, even though you didn't have to." The simple definition hit Astrid with the force of revelation. Love wasn't the abstract concept she had learned to avoid in business school. It was practical action, daily choices, the decision to put someone else's needs before your own convenience. Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence for a while. Three people who had been strangers that morning, but were now connected by shared experience and the possibility of genuine friendship. Astrid watched Nathan help Olivia with her fish saw, the patience and gentleness in every interaction, and began to understand what she had been missing in her pursuit of success. "Mr. Hayes," she said finally, "I have a proposition for you." Nathan raised an eyebrow, his expression cautious. "What kind of proposition?" "I run a company called Sterling Dynamics. We develop technology solutions for various industries, including aviation. We're always looking for people with your kind of expertise and judgment." "I appreciate the offer," Nathan said carefully, "but I'm happy with my current work." Are you really happy fixing other people's airplanes instead of flying your own?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Astrid saw something flicker in Nathan's eyes, a spark of the passion that had once driven him to excel in the cockpit. "It's not about what makes me happy," Nathan said finally. "It's about providing for Olivia, about being the father she needs. What if you could do both? What if you could fly again and still be the father she needs?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, cutting Olivia's fish into smaller pieces, while he considered the implications of Astrid's words. "I made a promise to my wife," he said eventually. "I promised her I would stay safe for Olivia's sake." "And you kept that promise today," Astrid pointed out. "You risked everything to save your daughter and everyone else on that airplane. Sarah would be proud of what you did." "Daddy," Olivia said quietly, "what would Mama want you to do?" The question came from the person whose opinion mattered most, and Nathan felt the weight of it settle over him like a mantle. What would Sarah want? She had always believed in following your calling, in using your gifts to help others and living fully rather than just safely. "She would want me to be happy," he admitted. "She would want me to use my skills to help people, not just to hide from the world." "Then maybe it's time to stop hiding," Astrid said gently. "Maybe it's time to start living again." They finished dinner in thoughtful silence, each of them processing the events of the day and the possibilities of tomorrow. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Astrid made one more attempt to bridge the gap between their worlds. "I know you probably think I'm just another wealthy executive trying to salve her conscience by doing good deeds," she said. "But what happened today? It changed me. I don't want to go back to being the person I was this morning. I want to learn how to be better." Nathan studied her face, seeing the sincerity there, the genuine desire for transformation. "It's not easy," he warned. "Learning to put other people first, learning to measure success by different standards." "Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I'm sure I can't go back to the way things were," Astrid replied. "And I think maybe you can help me figure out what comes next." Nathan looked down at Olivia, who was listening to their conversation with the intense focus she brought to important adult discussions. "What do you think, baby girl? Should we help Miss Astrid learn how to be happy?" Olivia considered the question seriously, then nodded. "I think Mama would say yes. She always helped sad people become happy people." The decision was made in that moment, sealed by the wisdom of a 7-year-old who understood love better than most adults. Nathan would take the job with Sterling. Dynamics would help Astrid transform her company into something more than just another profit-driven corporation. And Astrid would learn slowly, and sometimes painfully, how to measure success by the impact she had on other people's lives, rather than just the numbers in her bank account. 6 months later, Nathan stood in the cockpit of Sterling Dynamics' new medical transport aircraft, preparing for a mission that would have been impossible under the company's old philosophy. They were flying emergency medical supplies to a disaster zone, risking profit margins for the sake of saving lives. It was exactly the kind of work that Sarah would have supported, exactly the kind of use of his talents that honored her memory while keeping him close to home for Olivia. Astrid had proven to be a surprisingly dedicated student of compassion, transforming Sterling Dynamics from a pure profit-seeking enterprise into a company that balanced financial success with social responsibility. She had established programs for single parents, funded education initiatives, and most importantly, had learned to see her employees as human beings, rather than just resources to be optimized. The change hadn't been easy. Board members had resigned, investors had pulled funding, and Astrid had faced criticism from the business press for going soft. But she had also discovered something that had been missing from her life for decades, the satisfaction of work that mattered, relationships built on mutual respect, rather than fear, and the profound joy of using her abilities to lift others up, rather than climb over them. On quiet evenings, when Nathan would come home from work to find Astrid having dinner with them, a tradition that had developed naturally over the months, Olivia would sometimes look up from her homework and observe how different Miss Astrid had become. "Daddy," she said one such evening, "I think Miss Astrid learned how to practice love." Nathan looked across the dinner table at the woman who had once mocked him for his modest circumstances and now volunteered at Olivia's school, who had once measured worth by bank account balances and now measured it by the positive impact she could have on other people's lives. "I think you're right, sweetheart," he said. "I think she learned it very well." Astrid smiled at the compliment, but her attention was focused on the homework spread across the table. Not spreadsheets or profit projections, but math problems and spelling words, and the simple, profound work of helping a child learn about the world. "I had good teachers," she said, looking first at Nathan and then at Olivia. "I learned from the best." Outside, the Irish countryside rolled by in shades of green and gold, peaceful and timeless, and indifferent to the small human dramas that played out beneath its sky. But inside the modest home that Nathan and Olivia shared, and now occasionally Astrid as well, love had taken root and grown into something strong enough to weather any storm. The three of them had learned that heroes didn't always wear uniforms, that worth couldn't be measured by wealth, and that the most profound transformations often began with the simple decision to see other people as deserving of care and respect. Nathan had kept his promise to Olivia. He had always come back to her. But he had also learned that sometimes keeping one promise required breaking another, that sometimes love demanded risk rather than safety, and that the best way to honor Sarah's memory was not to hide from life, but to embrace it fully. As for Astrid, she had discovered that success felt entirely different when it was measured by the happiness of a 7-year-old girl, rather than the approval of shareholders. She had learned that the most valuable currency wasn't money, but trust, that the most important skills weren't negotiation tactics, but patience and kindness, and that the greatest victories were often the quietest ones. And Olivia, wise beyond her years, had learned that families could be built in many ways, that love could heal wounds that seemed impossible to mend, and that sometimes the best adventures began with the simple decision to be kind to a stranger. Flight 789 had landed safely at Shannon Airport on a day that none of them would ever forget. But the real journey, the journey toward becoming the people they were meant to be, had only just begun.